We have Dr. Linda Tickle-Degnen, professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at Tufts University. Her study was most recently deposited, The Emergence and Evolution of Social Self-Management of Parkinson's Disease. So we haven't had an opportunity yet to highlight that study since it hasn't been released yet, but we're looking forward to do that. And so we're looking forward to hearing from all of you.
I'm a newbie. I just got this grant in, I guess, around May, June, somewhere in that. And I hadn't even heard of it until I went to the K-12 meeting at University of Florida, and I saw you were having the CLDR event, and I said, oh, I've been wanting to do this since I started my work. So I apologize for not knowing about it beforehand. It sounds like it was well screened. The study I'm going to be talking about that I'm doing currently for the data archiving is called The Emergence and Evolution of Social Self-Management of Parkinson's Disease, or SOCM-PD. And it's an R01, finished its 6th year in April of 2019. So it's really fresh. I want to, let's see, let me make sure this is my lab, the Health Quality of Life Lab in the Arts and Sciences at Tufts University. And the work that we've done, my postdocs, some undergrads, some graduate students, computer science students are listed here, are shown here. But I want to do a shout out to Michael Stevenson, my project coordinator, who's really been the one uploading and doing a lot of the work. I was able to leverage the CLDR grant to give me 5 more months of his full time in my project because he was on soft money on the R01. And the deans of the arts and sciences decided to fund him for another 5 months. So that's really something to think about, to leverage your funding to get more if you need it. The work that I'm doing now is based on a series of R01s that, first of all, I got my great break from Alan Jetty when he was my dean at Boston University. And he gave me an internal Roy Ball grant, I think, of $7,000, and that was like gold. And he said, okay, you want to study facial expression in Parkinson's disease? Everybody was going, what in the heck is that useful for? And so he gave me my break. So thank you. Namaste, namaste. And then I eventually got an R01 from NINDS for healthcare stigma from the Fogarty RFP on healthcare stigma, one of the first in the time that we started studying healthcare stigma. And then NIA studied an RCT. We did an RCT with Robert Wagner, and that was NIA, and that was an interdisciplinary OTPT speech self-management RCT. That was published all in the neurological journals, nothing in the rehab journals. And then NINR was in 2013 the only institute, nursing research was the only institute interested in longitudinal studies that didn't involve fMRI. So they also had a very high priority of learning more about self-management for chronic disease. It was their #1 priority. And so it was funded immediately, almost. Except for there was Congress held it up for a year. We had a shutdown in Congress at that time for some reason. So it took a year to get the money. But what we did immediately was published our funded protocol. And that was one of our first publications. And the reason was basically, I thought, oh, wouldn't that be cool to get a publication early? But we were not required at 2013 to do data management, to do archiving, or anything like that. And when it got published, the program officers at NIH were surprised. And I was surprised they were surprised. And I said, why are they so surprised? And they said, you have so much courage. And I said, oh yeah, because now I have to do it the way I said I was going to do it. And so doing the publication right at the funding stage did for us, it gave us a real strong roadmap to follow so that we made sure that we lived up to our ideal. We all know it's an ideal that we do in our... The overarching aim was using a prospective cohort mixed method design, characterize social self-management trajectories of people with Parkinson's disease and secondarily their care partners as available over a 3-year period, and of naturalistic community living with 14 waves of mixed method assessment in relation to biopsychosocial factors. Never write that long of a sentence, but that gets it all out. And the biopsychosocial is what I'm using now. Thank goodness this is being revived as a term in successful aging and that sort of thing area. And yet the published protocol is all around the ICF. It's all about the same thing, you know. So it could be categorized, all of our variables can be categorized on the ICF. Now, the reason I started studying this is because in Parkinson's disease and in many self-management rehabilitation programs, there's a social is involved, but it's usually like one module in the self-management training programs. And so you get a lot more emphasis on the biological, the psychological, or emotional than you do on the social. And this is particularly true in Parkinson's disease, which up until recently was considered a motor dysfunction. Now it's considered a motor and the rest, non-motor dysfunction. And that's very recent. So, but at the time, everything was on motor and on gait in the funding. So I decided to use what was in the ICF for self-care of health. It's under the self-care domain. And then it was totally related to physical health prevention, the definition of health self-care. And I decided to revise that term, that definition, and add social into it. Now, the reason we wanted to do social self-management, which we define this way as socially mediated and contextualized, is that we wanted to inform self-management rehabilitation more along the social dimension, not eliminating the bio and the psycho, but actually integrate it better. And so we use these different models to inform our design and our measures and assessments. Our primary assessments and measures are these. It's mixed methods, so we have quantitative and thousands of qualitative transcripts. We also have videotapes, very carefully done videotapes for facial action coding, and we have facial expression tasks that are also coded. And so we have this whole group of social self-management measures that are socially, ecologically valid, they're sensitive, they have a good record for being very, have great construct validation. And then we also have qualitative measures that have worked in previous studies, including asking people to describe a frustrating activity, an enjoyable activity, how you manage to get out of the home, and then we have a 2-hour home visit about accessing the community. We then have a large number of disease and health and well-being measures that are disease-specific, like in the Movement Disorder Society Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scales, the medical histories and comorbidities, and a lot of medications that we have not yet categorized. So it was good to hear about the Iowa categorization system. I think Jonathan mentioned that. And then others, including SF12 and health quality of life for both caregiver and the person with Parkinson's. So we are studying not only the person with Parkinson's, but their caregiver's health and trajectory and social life over time, and as a couple. So we have different interviews separately for both and as a couple. That's why we generate so many transcripts. And then we have this social comfort. In the ICF, they call physical comfort as something that you try to derive from health self-care. So I use the term social comfort as being, you also need that as part of your health. And we have measures of stigma that are excellent. The stigma scale for chronic illness is a very powerful tool. Social isolation and partner relationship measures. Now, ours is not a large N. We had done power analysis based upon our RCT, and with our RCT we had power at about 100 people with Parkinson's disease for showing quality of life changes from the RCT intervention on self-management. But there had been very little research in Parkinson's disease with longitudinal that had any social measures in them at all. I think there were like 4 I could identify. And if there was a social measure, it was usually loneliness. And that did show change over time, increasing loneliness over time. So we had 90 people who we were able to enroll. It took 3 years because it was a highly, you could say, burdensome trial in that people had to come into our lab 6 times. We did 1 home visit for 2 hours of assessments. And their care partner also had to come in and be in separate rooms being interviewed, and then they came together and were assessed together as a couple. And then between those 7 in-person assessments, there were telephone assessments of about 20 minutes that had the SF-12 and have things changed, what events have happened since the last assessment, et cetera. We had a total retention by the 3rd year of 75%, which my data science friends, who especially those in Parkinson's, say is good. We would have loved to have had more, but it's pretty good. And we have found that all of our analyses have been highly powered so far. With mixed method time series, which is what we've done here, we aimed at discovery. And that was our primary aim, was discovery, given the state of the field. Within and between person heterogeneity was our focus, person-centered focus, and homogeneity, population-centered, in respect to social lifestyles with chronic disease. The findings so far, I don't have a lot of data to show you, but these are preliminary evidence and a lot of ancillary studies going on. I had a postdoc who got at F32 to do the mapping of the socio-emotional actions in the face to try to distinguish depression from motor control issues from dementia, because all of those conditions create loss of facial expression, which is a primary symptom of Parkinson's disease related to social life. So we identified that our constructs, these 3 constructs, which are summary variables, composite variables, that people engaged in naturalistic 3 practices that predicted their symptom severity and their quality of life, is what we found. Now, the difficult thing is we did a cluster analysis to develop profiles among these 3 different practices in social self-management, which are engaging with formal health resources like your provider relationship, engaging in activities in the home and community, engaging in social support exchange in close relationships, giving and receiving social support, because giving support has been found to be more important than receiving social support. So anyway, in people's lives for purpose and meaning. So people with PD grouped into 7 clusters. These are only 90 people with Parkinson's, but it was highly validated with other measures that we were looking at. you sometimes want smaller numbers of clusters to be able to explain it to people. But there were 7 different clusters with different profiles of how much people engaged in these 3 practices. And yet we validated it, so we're trying to explain this complex 7-cluster situation. But it also suited us because it did tell us there was heterogeneity in the social lives of people with Parkinson's that should be addressed in where they are in their symptoms. So the SOCM profiles are associated with symptom severity and quality of life at a very strong level. Over a 2-year period, this is our only longitudinal study so far, over a 2-year period, we've found that couples have interdependent patterns of retention and exchange of their IADL roles, with an overall decline by both of them in their retention of IADL. And the reason we did this quantitatively is we had early qualitative research that we did on our transcripts, and caregivers kept talking about IADL a lot in those transcripts. So that's why we focused on IADL. That's in the process of being prepared for publication. We've also done, we had a hypothesis that loss of facial expression would moderate the social life trajectories of people with Parkinson's over the longitudinal study, because we have found in our whole program of research for 20 years, since the Roybal grant, that facial expression is extremely relevant to social life. And I've done cross-cultural studies in Taiwan and America of neurological rehabilitation stigma with people with Parkinson's. And that was the NINDS study. And so neurologists who are highly trained, OTs, PTs, speech therapists who are highly trained in Parkinson's disease do no better in their diagnostic understanding of what's going on with people with Parkinson's disease than do older adults who view these really standardized videotapes we show of different facial masking across cultures. And that's because it's really hard to know what a person is, and we highly rely on the face at a very automatic, primal level. We've already decided whether that person is friendly, whether they can work with us. We looked at working alliance, we looked at depression. We think they're depressed and they aren't a person that we'd really like to treat. They're not going to follow through. That's what we found, and this is particularly true for women who across the world have been found. It's expected normatively that women will be more facially expressive, more emotional, and men will be more stoic and less emotional. So it's highly stigmatizing for women to lose their facial expression. And so we've already found in this study, based on a lot of other studies, that PD quality of life is mediated by felt and enacted stigma, their own feeling of stigma and their perception that other people are stigmatizing them, and moderated by gender, meaning it affects both men and women. Both men and women are stigmatized, but women feel it more strongly. And we controlled for depression in this because depression can also really have a huge impact on quality of life. And it did not reach significance as a mediator for quality of life and when stigma was controlled. But stigma had practically, it had big effect sizes and it was statistically significant. And we also found that care partners depression and their experience of social rejection was associated with their partner's facial expressive loss. Okay, so that's what we've found so far, and most of that's published except for the first one. We're in the process of getting a review for the cluster paper, and it's been accepted with revision. And then the SOCM, the loss of facial expression, those have been published already. Okay, so that's what the study is. The research team I've been working with Marie St. Hilaire, movement disorder neurologist at Boston Medical Center for 20 years in our work. They formed the key co-investigator team, and Kathy Thomas, a neurological nurse. I work with a data scientist, Elena Nemova, at Tufts University. We met at a committee, and she studies how social rituals are highly involved in cholera around the world, resurgence of cholera. So she said, hey, let's do a time series together. I said, okay, let's do that. And that's how the time series came about. We also have Boston University macro level social worker on the project for a variety of reasons. Barbara Haberman, who studies end-of-life issues and Parkinson's disease. Sue Berger was donated by Boston University as a visiting scholar, given funding to be a visiting scholar in my lab for several years, and she did the first qualitative published work for us. Then we had Sarah Gunnery, who got an F-32 based on the NIH program, and Mike Stevenson was a project coordinator, and then hundreds of students, undergraduates through postdocs, Fulbright scholars, postdocs, pre-docs from different countries. And so our research team, the reason, I wrote down notes here for the reason that we decided to do this archiving experience. First of all, I'm an experimental social psychologist by my PhD training. After I became an occupational therapist, I went, and my mentor at Harvard in psychology was Robert Rosenthal, one of the grandparents of meta-analysis and effect size usage. And he also had been a clinician before he became a social psychologist professor at Harvard, and so was already a translational guy. And he said to his students, science is not science if you don't communicate the findings. Science is fundamentally a human social endeavor. And we all know this. We're always saying, oh, we have bias because of our previous beliefs and such. But if you don't publish the findings, it's not considered science in his eyes. So I was grown up with that. And I had great mentors at USC, Jean Ayers and Betty Icpsr before that, and started my research 43 years ago. I was calculating this morning. So they also were very translational. The other big reason we decided to do it, people who do research in the Parkinson's community, and you know this about disease-specific kinds of research, are extremely grateful to the participants who in that community who contribute to their work. And this is true for all my team. They've been engaging in our work, and we want to give back to them. They really work hard to be in these studies, and it is a burden to them. So this is one of our major givebacks, is to archive the data so that their work would really be sufficiently used. And then let's see, I'm trying to rush so you can go to lunch. Then all of the team, I was a little reticent because I didn't know, it's my baby, like you said, Jonathan. I really thought, oh, this is my baby. Are other researchers going to treat my baby right? Are they going to help my baby? And yet, all of the team, including Elena Nemova, she's not an exclamation mark writer on emails. She was yes, 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 because she works with NIH to try to get them at this replicability. She's a data scientist. And so she was saying, and make it totally public. Don't restrict anything. But so everybody was on board, and I was very careful to make sure they felt comfortable with it, but they all felt very, very positive about it. The benefits of working with Icpsr, I don't have to say it again, it's absolutely true. I'll triangulate on those particular remarks. It has been a true pleasure. I have learned a tremendous amount about de-identification and what that means and how to do that. I have also, and I'm in the process of learning more, as I just talked to Suk Lee about. I started 20 years ago, I had started looking at Radcliffe's repository on the study of lives, because that was the only repository I knew about. And I talked to them about videotapes. I had done videotape analysis in my dissertation research. And they were going, oh, they didn't know what to do, and the technology really wasn't there. They had some old scratchy videotapes. So that started a long time ago. That was actually 40 years ago more that I was talking to them about that. Then I started what I now know is called file sharing, and I wrote up my own, yes, and I wrote up my own, I learned that today. I made my own contracts, which are useless, especially because I do collaborate extensively with the AI community. I'm on the faculty of the Human-Robot Interaction PhD program and the Cognitive Science PhD program. And I do a lot of collaboration with computer scientists and AI people around. So I have learned, and we've published a previous data set we published in PLOS, and it terrified me to do that. And then what I have found is that they lose my data sets. Some of the computer scientists, they don't understand HIPAA. I mean, I de-identify it, but I've had people lose my data sets or say, can I send that to my colleagues in Georgia Tech? And I say no, and I know they do. And so I love working with computer scientists, but they just don't have the training in the same kind of ethics research that we do when we're in the healthcare field. And so my work is often used, the facial, we've done algorithms for facial facial action with computer science very successfully at BU, and with a doctoral student at BU who did one. And then we've done a lot of transcript sharing and with AI for natural language processing and developing social robotics that can understand Parkinsonian speech as well as Parkinsonian words. So that's where, and I use the linguistic inquiry word count, and which I'm going to mention in a second here, for which is a word count of 280 categories of meaning, of human meaning, language meaning. And so the AI people are constantly trying to develop new algorithms that perform better than linguistic inquiry word count, which is actually very good and has a very strong track record. Here at University of Texas, Austin, James Pennebaker. So I have a contract with them and one of his students. He developed the Luke in the 50s. Let's see. Okay, so Icpsr is just a relief to me. So I'm getting a great amount of social comfort because I feel very trusting based on the level of skill and the professionalism that they bring to it. It's very comforting. Okay, and finally, I want to give you some tips. Nobody mentioned, or maybe you did, I'm sorry if I forgot, that you have to be very careful with your IRB consent forms. They were not anticipating data sharing in 2013, and we had the top of the line at the time. I was very proud of our consent forms, but we feel really like maybe we should go back and ask people about, can we use your faces in the data if they're alive. We have had some morbidity and mortality in our people in our study. And so having really good consent forms from the very beginning is great. We also, because we published I hired Mike Stevenson because he was an experimental social psychologist. He was my project coordinator and was really used to data rigor in experimentation. So we put everything on REDCap, and we had independent double entry by research assistants, and then had to resolve any distinctions between the differences in the data management. We had, in our transcripts, we were audio transcribed, and then research assistants checked those and then made sure that Michael Stevenson would confirm that if that something was an error, that he could recall what he had interviewed people about, or other interviewers that we had. So we had very rigorous data management. And finally, I'm going to stop. I think the tips then is, oh yes, I know what I'm going to say. Well, I won't, because I think it's time's up. But the linguistic inquiry word count might be a way of identifying identifiable data in transcripts. And so we're formatting the transcripts for linguistic inquiry word count, where you can highlight proper names, proper locations, and other. So I'm going to talk to you about that at lunch today to see if that could work, so that we don't have to go through these thousands of transcripts. You just run them through the Luke in a few seconds, and they'll tell you which transcripts have all of these things. Okay, finally, an example of interesting reuse of our data. Well, it's not out there yet, and yet I got an email from one of my former students, now a professor in Taiwan, saying, "Linda, when can we use your data?" And I said, "How'd you learn about that?" Maybe it was through ACR. I don't know how they learned about it, because I'm not publishing about it yet. I thought only my colleagues knew about it, and you. And so I said, well, he said, "Can we use it in Asia?" And so I emailed Shane, and he said, "There are no geographic restrictions." And I said, "I can't imagine why there would be, but I never know in this day and age." So I was able to tell him this week, yeah, you'll be able to use it when I get it up there. So anyway, that's it. Okay.
And that is, to what extent are the original informed consent forms and IRBs a barrier to archiving? And what has been the general practice? Because generally the data are de-identified when it's shared, and I just don't know what the problems around this particular issue is.
Well, I can tell you, and maybe other people can chime in for this, for Parkinson's disease, the people that the movement disorder clinic I work with is involved in a lot of trials, Michael J. Fox trials and multi-site trials and that sort of thing. So we used their best practice of HIPAA information, how their HIPAA data would be protected. And then we had a box for, if, first of all, do you consent to be in the study? And if yes, would you mind if we use your data for education purposes? And another box you can check for other research studies. So most of the people, except for 4 caregivers and 4 people with Parkinson's, said no. Only 4 in each of these groups said no. The rest said yes. But at the time in 2013, they had no idea about sharing their faces to the public. So I was asked by a neurological group who's doing when we got the grant, we signed ourselves on clinicaltrials.gov. We were not considered a clinical trial in 2013, being a longitudinal study. Now we're considered a clinical trial, so we signed up for that. And I got an email from someone saying, "Why didn't you post your consent forms?" And I said, "Oh, should we do that on clinicaltrials.com?" And he said, "It would be very helpful for us. We're trying to see what the standards are for practice for data sharing." And I said, "Well, I did this in 2013. He says, "That's okay, because I think a lot of people don't share their data without asking for reuse." And I'm not sure about that, but they were doing a study on that. What do you think is the standard?
Jonathan?
Oh, I wasn't going to say standard, but I was going to say that there were indeed challenges in sort of working between both from an IRB standpoint and also contractually between our parent institution in Michigan that took some time to work that through with the transfer of data. So I would allow for some time and effort around those concerns.
I met with our IRB coordinator twice. They changed people, so I met with the first one and the second one, and they both agreed. They looked over our consent forms and said, this looks fine. But now I have to go through another procedure she said, after you hear about how well the de-identification goes, then resubmit, and it should not be a problem based on our IRB experience. Now, we're an academic IRB. It's not in a medical facility. This is an arts and sciences.
And that's what we recommend, is that we go back to the IRB in these instances where data sharing wasn't fully envisioned or the risks have changed, and get the IRB to weigh in on the applicability of the plan that you would use with any particular archive that would handle your data, to make sure that the archives protocols would be consistent with what was promised in the informed consent.
Yes.
And,
So I'll get some help in that, because we just had a fusion of our medical center IRB with our social behavioral IRB, and now it's more legalistic than it was before. It was more human ethics based primarily, and now it's really legal to protect the institution.
Yeah, and it's actually getting a little bit more complicated. I'm also from the University of Michigan Medical Center, because I think, as Jonathan Bean has mentioned, in our institution, it goes beyond the IRB. They have a special office that looks at data sharing and contractual arrangements, so you have to jump 2 hoops to get there. And
Yes.
It's complicated. It's very complicated.
Yes, and we just have a new open data science center that just opened last week, a new one in the arts and sciences at Tufts. So I'm hoping, I got to do it quickly, so I make sure I do it correctly. Anyway, any more questions? Thank you.